The night smelled like roses and humiliation. Ava stood beneath the glittering prom lights, frozen. Her fingers clutched the fabric of her deep blue gown, the gown she had saved 3 months of babysitting money to buy. The one she had pressed and repressed and pressed again this morning, telling herself that tonight would be different, that tonight the world would finally see her the way she saw herself. She had been wrong. The laughter started at the edges, quiet, like the first crackling of ice before a lake gives way. Then it spread, sharp, cruel, suffocating the way smoke fills a room before anyone sees the flame. And then she heard his voice, cold, merciless, perfectly, deliberately calm. "You are nothing but a fat, ugly duck, and I would never, not in this lifetime or any other, accept you as my mate." The words didn't just hit her, they cut, deeper than she knew words could cut, deep enough to reach the soft, secret place inside her chest where she had been nurturing the mate bond like a candle, feeding it, protecting it, refusing to let the wind touch it. For 2 years, she felt it flicker, then shatter. A sound like crystal breaking underwater. Low, resonant, wrong. Gasps spread across the hall in a wave. Ava stood perfectly still. The mate bond's warmth was gone. Where it had lived, there was nothing now. Only a cold, ringing hollow, like the air inside an empty church at midnight. Her boyfriend, her mate, her everything, had just rejected her, publicly, deliberately, in front of every person she had ever known. The whispers came like knives. She thought he'd actually choose her. Look at her. Did she seriously think she was enough for him? Pathetic. Tears burned the backs of Ava's eyes. Her throat tightened until breathing felt like swallowing glass. But she refused. She refused to let a single tear fall. Not here. Not in front of them. Not for him. She raised her chin, turned, and ran. She didn't know it yet, but the worst moment of her life was also the last moment of the girl she used to be. Before we begin, if you love dark LYcan kings, forbidden mates, and stories that make your heart ache, like, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for epic LYcan king romances, where omegas rise, kings fall, and love is never gentle. Collision with destiny. The night air hit her like a wall. Cold, sharp, relentless. When she had abandoned her heels somewhere between the door and the parking lot. She couldn't remember when, only that she was running now, her bare feet scraping against pavement, still warm from the day's sun, her breath tearing out of her in ragged, ugly bursts that she was glad no one could hear. The street was empty, the town asleep. Every street lamp cast its circle of orange light down onto the road, and she ran through them, one by one, in and out of the dark, like she was crossing thresholds between worlds. Why? Why me? Why tonight? Why? Why did I think? She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, swallowing the sound that wanted to come out. She didn't see them. She never saw them. She hit something solid, staggered, and nearly went down. Would have gone down if a hand hadn't shot out and closed around her arm. Strong and inescapable. Warm in a way that should have been alarming. She found her footing, looked up, and froze. 3 men stood before her in the amber circle of a street lamp. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of still that predators go when they've decided they don't need to move. And at her feet, glittering against the dark pavement like a fallen star, lay the shattered remains of what had been, moments ago, a pearl. But not an ordinary pearl. Even broken, it shimmered. A deep, oceanic light that pulsed and faded, like the last heartbeat of something very old and very powerful. Ava stared at it, then stared at them. Silence. Riven. Well, that's unfortunate. The one who spoke had a sharp face. The kind of face that looked like it was always on the edge of a joke, or the edge of a threat, or possibly both at once. Dark eyes, a smile that didn't reach them. The one in the center said nothing. He simply looked at her. He was the tallest and the coldest, and the silence around him felt earned, the way silence feels around mountains. The third stood slightly back, watching. He hadn't moved. She got the impression he rarely needed to. Riven. That pearl was worth 3 million. Give or take. Ava's mouth opened, closed. Ava. I didn't see you. I was running, and I didn't. I don't have. The tall one in the center stepped forward. She stopped talking immediately. It wasn't a choice. Something in the way he moved simply commanded silence. Kyle, you have two options. His voice was like the first toll of a midnight bell. Low, measured, irresistible. Kyle, you repay the cost in full, or a pause. Kyle, you serve us. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ava watched the ripples move through her entire body. Ava, serve? The third brother finally moved. He tilted his head just slightly. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Darius, for life. The world tilted. Ava looked between the three of them, this impossible, immovable, terrifying triad of men, and felt the universe narrowing to a single point. She had nothing. No money, no power, no mate, no one waiting at home who would notice if she disappeared. And something was happening in her chest that she couldn't name. A low, persistent pull toward these strangers, like gravity had shifted and chosen a new direction. She should have screamed. She should have run. The corner of Kale's mouth curved, barely perceptible, like the first crack in ancient ice. Kyle, you belong to us now. The contract. The document was parchment, real parchment, the color of old bone, dense and weighty in a way that modern paper never was. The runes written across it in deep crimson ink shifted slightly as Ava watched, as if they were breathing. Ava, this isn't real. She said it quietly like a prayer, like if she said it with enough conviction, the universe might agree with her. Riven. Oh, it's real. Extremely, legally, magically binding, real. Sign it. He leaned back against the dark wood of the study wall, arms folded, watching her with that sharp-edged amusement that she was already beginning to hate. Riven. Or face consequences. Your choice, little runner. Ava looked down at the contract, at the blank space at the bottom, waiting. She thought of her mother, dead 3 years, of her father, absent her entire life, of the apartment she could barely afford, of the scholarship she was 1 semester from losing, of the mate bond, her beautiful, fragile, hopeful mate bond, lying shattered on a gymnasium floor 20 minutes ago. She had run so far and ended up exactly here. Maybe this is what you get, said the voice she was always trying to outrun, for thinking you deserve better. She pressed her fingertip to the parchment. The brand came instantly, a searing, white-hot agony that burned from her fingertip up through her wrist and settled there, pulsing like a second heartbeat. She gasped, clutching her arm, and when the fire faded, she looked down at the mark left behind. A crescent moon, 3 stars arranged around it, beautiful, way in the way that only dangerous things are. Cal spoke from the doorway, where he had been watching the entire time without expression. Cal, welcome home, pet. Ava looked up at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Something new. Something she couldn't yet name. Not fear. Something fiercer than fear. The Palace of Monsters. The palace was not a building. Buildings were made by human hands with human measurements for human comfort. They had right angles and familiar smells. Wood polish and dust and the residue of ordinary lives. This was something else. It rose from the earth the way mountains rise. Not constructed, but erupted. Dark stone against darker sky. Its towers twisting upward at angles that didn't quite make geometric sense. The windows were long and narrow, like eyes narrowed in suspicion. With the gates, iron, ancient, elaborate, swung open at their approach without anyone touching them, and the shadows inside moved. Not dramatically, not like a horror story. They simply shifted, subtly, the way shadows shift when something living passes through a room. As if the darkness here had weight and preference and opinions about who was allowed to pass. Ava stepped through the great doors and felt the palace notice her. It was a physical sensation, like walking into a gaze. Kyle, you'll clean, you'll cook, you'll obey. He walked ahead without looking back, his voice carrying perfectly in the stone corridor. Kyle, no questions, no defiance, no leaving. Riven appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him move, which was its own kind of unsettling. Riven, try anything clever. He let the silence finish the sentence. Connor Darius said nothing. He was simply there, at the edge of her vision, a shadow that happened to have a face. Ava followed them deeper into the palace and said nothing. She was observing. The corridors were lined with portraits, generations of faces, all bearing the same quality. Power held so long it had become invisible to them, like water to fish. The furniture was dark and enormous and impeccable. No dust, no disorder. A household run with military precision. Her room, if it could be called hers, was at the end of a long corridor, past a window that looked out onto a courtyard where a stone wolf the size of a small car sat in permanent vigil. The room was small, a bed, a washstand, a window with iron bars, a cage with better lighting. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and looked at the crescent moon brand on her wrist. Unowned. The words sat in her chest like a stone. But something else was there too. Something that had no word yet. Something that had started the moment she walked through those gates. She didn't know what it was. She only knew that it didn't feel like defeat. The truth about her body, 3 weeks. That was how long it took Ava to realize something was wrong. Or perhaps not wrong. Perhaps the opposite of wrong. Perhaps for the first time in her life, something was exactly right in a way she had never been equipped to recognize. She was getting stronger. Not in the way gym memberships promise. Gradual, effortful, modest. This was different. This was her body rewriting itself from the inside, expanding into a shape it had always been meant to inhabit but had been too suppressed to reach. She noticed it first in the mornings. The heavy stone floors that had left her calves screaming in the first days now passed beneath her feet like nothing. The enormous iron pots in the kitchen, pots that the household staff struggled with in pairs, she lifted alone without thinking, her senses sharpened. She could smell rain 3 hours before it arrived. She could hear conversations through stone walls. She could feel, in the base of her spine, when one of the brothers entered a room she hadn't entered yet, and her body, the body that had been mocked her entire life, the body she had spent years trying to apologize for, felt powerful, not in spite of its curves, because of them, like it had always been carrying something it hadn't been ready to use. She heard them through the library wall on a Tuesday night. While she was cleaning the corridor outside, she stopped, pressed herself still, listened. Darius. She's changing. A pause. Kyle. Yes. Riven. Faster than expected. Darius. She was never human. Was she? It wasn't a question. Silence. Then from Kyle. Very quiet. Kyle. She's the lost bloodline. Ava goes very, very still. Riven. You're certain? Kyle. The mark confirmed it. The moment she signed the contract, the runes recognized her blood. She is the queen's heir. Direct line. Ava flattened her back against the stone wall. The world was still there. The corridor, the candlelight, the cold stone under her palms. But it had a different quality now, like a painting of a corridor rather than a real one. The queen's heir. Her mother had told her she was ordinary. Her ex-mate had told her she was nothing. And her entire life had been a story about a girl who didn't belong anywhere. But what if the story had been wrong from the beginning? What if she had never been the ugly duckling? What if the pond had simply been the wrong place? Awakening. Silence at first, then fire. A low, ancient horn. The moon, impossibly large, impossibly close. It started with a dream. Or not a dream. something older than dreams, something that had been waiting in the dark of her blood for 19 years, patient as a stone, waiting for the moment she was finally still enough to hear it. She stood in a place with no ground, or perhaps the ground was light, silver white, and shifting like the surface of a slow river. Above her, the moon filled half the sky. Around her, fire but cold fire, the color of starlight, burning without heat. And in a voice. It had no gender, no age, no single direction. It came from everywhere, the way the sound of your own heartbeat comes from everywhere. You were never meant to bow. Ava woke. Pain detonated through her body. Not the ordinary pain of injury, but the pain of transformation. The pain of a chrysalis, of something becoming what it was always supposed to be, burning through the too small shape of what it had been before. She arched off the bed, gasping, her fingers tearing the sheets. Then her eyes opened, and they were silver. Pure, burning, molten silver. Not the silver of jewelry or decoration, but the silver of lightning and moonlight, and the edge of a blade that has never been used and never needed to be. The air around her crackled. Every window in the room blew outward, every candle lit simultaneously. On the stone walls, 6 inches of ancient granite vibrated. The door flew off its hinges. All 3 brothers stood in the corridor beyond. They had moved instantly, simultaneously, with a speed that should have been impossible. Kyle in the center, Riven to the left, Darius to the right. All 3 were staring. Kyle's face, that mask of absolute composure, had cracked. Not much, just enough. His eyes moved over her, the silver of her eyes, the power radiating off her like heat from a forge. And for the first time since she had met him, she saw something move in his expression that he hadn't chosen to put there. Riven let out a slow breath. Riven. Well, Darius didn't speak. He was watching her with the focused attention of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. Kyle, this changes things. Ava looked at her hands. Adra, the power was still moving through her. Vast, warm, like a river that had been dammed her entire life and had finally found its way to open water. This is mine, she thought. This has always been mine. The real bond. They came to her the next morning, all 3, together, which told her instinctively that they had discussed this, had perhaps argued about it, though she couldn't imagine any of them arguing conventionally, and had arrived at a conclusion. Kyle stood in the center of the room. The morning light caught the angles of his face differently than candlelight did. Less like a king, more like a man. Still dangerous, still immovable. But something had shifted overnight. Kyle, you are not our servant. Ava waited. Kyle, you are our mate. The silence that followed was enormous. Then Ava laughed. Not the warm, surprised kind of laugh, the other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere hollow, from somewhere that has been hurt so precisely and so recently that the humor of anything feels like cruelty. Ava. No. Her voice was steadier than she expected. Ava, I was rejected, remember? A mate bond doesn't just... You can't simply... Darius. That bond was false. He said it simply, the way he said everything, with the quiet authority of a man who never wastes precision. Darius. He was never your true mate. The bond you felt with him was a sympathetic resonance, proximity, shared adolescence, your power recognizing his wolf and creating a shadow of connection. Darius. But it wasn't real? Ava stared at him. Riven. The real bond... He spread his hands almost apologetically, which was perhaps the most alarming thing she had seen yet. Riven. Is us, all 3, which is admittedly complicated. Ava's heart was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. She felt it. Standing in that room, surrounded by these 3 impossible men, she felt the bond. Not the fragile, careful thing she had nurtured for 2 years. This was different. This was a root system, not a candle. Ancient, deep, strong enough that the idea of breaking it was not tragic, but simply structurally absurd. The way breaking a mountain is absurd, it had always been there. She had simply never been in the right room before. She looked at Kyle, at Riven, at Darius. They watched her with a patience that she realized, with a jolt, was the patience of men who were afraid of her answer. She didn't answer. Not yet. She turned to the window and looked out at the dark kingdom below, the forests and the stone and the sky, and she felt the truth of herself settling into her bones like iron cooling into shape. From broken to queen, she said yes, not to them, not with words. She said it the way she did everything from that point forward, by showing up. Training began the next morning before sunrise. It was brutal. Cal drilled combat, not the ceremonial kind, but the real kind. The kind that leaves marks and teaches lessons by making them cost something. He was merciless. He expected her to fall, and she fell, and he said nothing, and expected her to get up, and she got up, and that was the entirety of his encouragement. It was exactly what she needed. Riven taught her power, how to find it, how to shape it, or how to call it without burning down everything around her. He was patient in this, beneath the jokes, with the focused patience of someone who understands a skill deeply enough to teach it without ego. Darius taught her strategy, how to read a room, a face, a battlefield, how to think 3 moves ahead and leave your opponent wondering if they'd started the game at all. He was the quietest teacher. He said things once. She learned to listen the first time. She failed constantly. She got up constantly. And something that had been broken in her for 19 years, something that had been chipped at, mocked, starved, rejected, dismissed, began to reform. Not into what it had been before, into something it had never been allowed to be. She got faster, stronger, more precise. The silver light in her eyes became easier to call, and then easier still, and then it was simply always there. A low burn behind her irises that she stopped noticing the way you stop noticing your own breathing. 6 weeks in, she threw Cale across the training yard. He got up, said nothing, nodded once. That was the closest he had ever come to a standing ovation. One evening near the end of the 2nd month, she stood on the highest balcony of the palace and looked out at the kingdom stretching below. The forests, the villages, the distant gleam of water. Kyle appeared beside her. He did that sometimes. Arrived without announcement, stood without explanation, as if his presence were simply a fact of the landscape. They laughed at me, Ava said, into the dark. He was quiet for a moment. Kyle, they won't anymore. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his profile against the night sky. She believed him. The reckoning. She chose the night of the full moon. She didn't plan it that way. Or perhaps she did, somewhere beneath conscious thought, because full moons were when her power ran highest and loudest and most completely hers. She walked into the gymnasium alone. The winter formal was in full swing. The same hall, the same lights, the same cheap streamers, and the same collective social performance that passed for celebration. The music was different, but the feeling was the same. She had been here before, but everything else had changed. She was wearing black, not the apologetic, trying to disappear black of her former wardrobe, but the deliberate, absolute black of someone who has stopped needing to justify the space they occupy. And her silver eyes were calm. Her posture was the posture of a woman who has thrown a king across a yard and felt him nod at her in respect. The music didn't stop, but the conversations did. One by one, in a wave that moved from the door inward, people stopped talking and turned to look at her. She walked through the silence and let them look. She found him near the back. He looked exactly the same. That handsome face, that easy confidence, that casual cruelty that passes for personality when you're young and powerful and have never been held accountable for anything. He saw her. She watched the color leave his face. X, you... She stopped, stood in front of him, looked at him with the calmest eyes she had ever felt behind her face. Ava, reject me again. His knees hit the floor, not dramatically, not with any visible cause, and simply, The power in her presence pressed down on him, and his legs gave way, the way a candle gives way when you hold a torch next to it. X. I'm sorry. Ava. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Ava. You knew exactly who I was. Her voice was quiet. That was the most frightening thing about it. Ava. You chose to decide it wasn't enough. She looked around the hall, at every face that had laughed, every mouth that had whispered, every person who had watched and said nothing and gone home feeling comfortable. The air around her trembled. Ava, I was never the ugly duckling. The lights flickered. Her eyes blazed silver. Ava, I was the storm, and storms don't apologize for the damage they were never meant to prevent. She walked out, without looking back. The hall was silent until she was gone. What she is. The truth about her bloodline came in pieces. A leather-bound chronicle, 600 years old, kept in the deepest part of the palace library in a case that required Kale's blood to open. Darius translated. Riven read aloud when Darius's voice went tight. Her mother had been the youngest daughter of the last LYcan queen, the one who had vanished during the War of the Pale Moon, 30 years ago, presumed dead. She hadn't died. She had run, stripped herself of her power. A brutal, irreversible act, like cutting out your own spine, and hidden herself among humans. Hidden her daughter among humans. Given her child an ordinary name and an ordinary life, and the extraordinary burden of power she had no context for. Ava sat with this for a long time. She had been angry at her mother for dying, and now she didn't know what she was. Riven. She was trying to protect you. He said it without his usual armor of wit, just plainly, with the gentleness he kept very carefully hidden. Riven. She knew what the enemies of the crown would do to an heir if they found one. Ava. She could have told me. Darius. Yes. Simple. No argument. He understood that both things were true simultaneously, the love and the wound. Kale poured her a glass of something dark and warm and set it in front of her without a word. She drank it. Then she opened the next page of the chronicle. If she was going to be a queen, she was going to know exactly what she was inheriting. The coronation. The coronation was not what she expected. She had expected ceremony, the solemn, formal kind, with scripted movements and careful words, and the distant feeling of watching yourself from above. She had expected to feel like an imposter in a costume. She didn't. Standing at the center of the great hall, with the assembled LYcans of 12 clans, arranged in a silence so complete she could hear individual heartbeats. Ava felt, for the first time in her life, exactly like what she was. The crown was old iron and dark silver, set with a single stone, the color of a full moon. It weighed more than it looked like it should. The elder who placed it on her head did so with hands that shook, not from age, but from the magnitude of what was happening. Something that had been gone for 30 years, returned. Hours she looked out at the assembled faces, at the powerful and the ancient and the scarred, and felt the bond running between her and the three brothers like a current through deep water. Cal to her left, Riven to her right. Darius behind her, the quiet axis of everything. The elder's voice rang out. Elder, the queen has returned, and the hall answered. Not in words, in the sound of every LYcan present throwing back their head and howling, all at once, in a wave that began at the front and rolled backward, pouring up through the stone and into the sky. It was the most beautiful sound Ava had ever heard. It sounded like belonging. What they are to each other. She accepted the bond in the old way, not with words because there were no words old enough for what a true mate bond was. She accepted it the way the moon accepts the tide, by simply ceasing to resist the thing that had always been inevitable. With Kyle, it was like standing inside a thunderstorm and discovering that the lightning recognized you. He was not tender. He was precise. He showed love the way great stone structures show love, by being immovable, by being there, by bearing weight without complaint for centuries. With Riven, it was warmth. unexpected, disarming, the kind that sneaks under your defenses while you're laughing. He made her feel, for the first time, that joy was not something she had to earn. With Darius, it was depth. He saw her, not the power, not the crown, not the bloodline. Her, the girl who had run barefoot through the dark, and the woman who had risen from that running. He saw both and chose both without hesitation. 3 mates, 3 different kinds of love, all of them real, all of them hers. She had been told her whole life that she was too much. It turned out she had simply needed a world that was large enough. The throne of shadows, grand, full, a kingdom in its rhythms. Then something breaks. Urgency, running footsteps. 3 months into her reign, Ava had begun to understand what being queen actually meant, not the ceremonial part. She had adapted to that quickly, discovering that she had an instinct for it, as if the role had been waiting in her bones all along. The councils, the judgments, the careful management of alliances between clans who had been arguing since before her grandmother was born. No, the real weight was quieter than that. It was the faces. The LYcan children who came to the palace gates to catch a glimpse of the queen who had come back. The elderly who wept at council because they had lived through the time without a crown and had not expected to see its return. The young warriors who straightened their spines differently now, as if having a queen made the sky higher. She carried them, all of them, and she found to her own astonishment that she was strong enough. She was on the throne when the messenger arrived, running, breathless. His face carrying the specific look of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to deliver. Messenger, Your Majesty, the Void Court has sent an envoy. The room went still in the way that rooms go still when something dangerous enters the conversation. Kale's jaw tightened. Riven stopped smiling. Darius went very quiet, which, what she had learned, was his version of an alarm. Kale, that's impossible. The Void Court was destroyed. Messenger, evidently not, sire. They are at the eastern border. They have a message. He produced a scroll, sealed in black wax with a sigil she didn't recognize, but that made her blood react. A deep, ancient recognition. The way your body recognizes cold water even before your mind processes the sensation. She took it, broke the seal, read. The words were simple, formal, in a language older than the kingdom she now ruled. But she understood it. Her blood translated it, the way it had always known things her mind had been kept from. The ancient enemies had not been destroyed. They had been waiting. For the heir. For her. She looked up at her 3 kings, her mates, her equals. A slow smile spread across her face. The kind of smile that makes very sensible people back toward the door. Ava. Good. She rose from the throne. Power gathered around her like a cloak, silver-edged and certain. Ava, I was getting bored. Kyle stepped forward. There was something in his eyes that she recognized now. The dark anticipation of a creature who has been waiting for a worthy war. Kyle, shall we remind them who rules this world? Ava stepped forward to meet him. Ava, let them come. The storm that never slept. 1 year later, the Void Court's envoy had been a threat. Ava had sent a counter-message with 2 words. Come then. They had come. The Battle of the Eastern Ridge lasted 11 hours. It was the kind of battle that gets written into the kind of chronicles that are kept in locked cases requiring royal blood to open. The kind that become legend before the ground is even cold. Ava fought at the front. This had been a source of fierce argument with all 3 of her mates, who had each, in their different ways, expressed the opinion that their queen should be behind the lines, protected, preserved. She had listened to all 3 of them with great patience. Then she had walked to the front. The Void Court's commander, a creature called the Ash Lord who had lived for 600 years and killed more things than most people had ever seen, had looked at her across the battlefield. And she had looked back. What he saw in her eyes had made him hesitate. That was all she needed. The battle ended before sunrise. The Void Court did not return. The aftermath was quieter than the war. Reconstruction, diplomacy, the long, careful work of building peace, which was always harder than winning a battle because it required you to win every single day, incrementally against entropy and fear and old grievances that didn't want to stay buried. Ava was good at it. She was better at it than she was at fighting, which surprised her, and then didn't, because she thought about her mother. About a woman who had loved her kingdom enough to destroy herself protecting it, who had made a terrible choice between her daughter's safety and her daughter's truth. Ava had made different choices. She was trying to make them better. The night she almost lost it, it happened in winter, 3 months after the Eastern victory, when the celebrations had quieted and the rebuilding was underway, and everyone, including Ava, had made the mistake of beginning to breathe normally. The assassin came from inside the palace. One of the household staff, a young woman named Sarah, who had been kind and quiet and unremarkable for 2 years, which is exactly the quality you look for in a spy. She had been placed there before Ava's arrival. She had been waiting. The blade came from behind, in Ava's private chambers, 3 hours past midnight. It was fast. It was precise. It should have worked. But Ava had been training for a year with 3 of the best fighters alive, and her power, that silver river she had spent a year learning to navigate, had become as instinctive as breathing. She caught the blade, with her hand, without thinking. The way you catch something that's falling before your mind has finished registering that it was moving. The wound was real, blood welling between her fingers, the cold shock of it. She was not invulnerable. She had never imagined she was, but she was still standing. Sarah froze. Ava looked at the blade in her hand, then looked at Sarah. Ava. Who sent you? Sarah said nothing. All 3 brothers were in the room before Ava finished the question. The Bond had announced the danger before she'd had time to consciously feel it. Kyle with a drawn blade. Riven in front of Ava before she'd seen him move. Darius with his hand already at Sarah's throat, not squeezing, simply there, the way a closing door is simply there. The interrogation that followed was quiet and efficient and yielded a name that changed everything. It's because the one who had sent Sarah was not the Void Court, was not an external enemy, was not something they had already defeated. It was someone inside the council, a face she knew, a voice she trusted, the High Elder who had placed the crown on her head. Ava sat with this for one night. One night of grief, quiet, thorough grief for the reality that power attracts betrayal the way light attracts moths, and that you cannot be a queen without learning this lesson, and that learning it costs something that doesn't grow back. Then she got up, fixed herself a cup of something hot, and went to work. What she learned about power. The High Elder's trial was held in the Great Hall with the same assembled council that had witnessed her coronation. Ava presided. She did not rage. She did not perform. She presented the evidence with the calm precision Darius had taught her, conducted the proceedings with the authority Cal had modeled, and, when the sentence was delivered, met the elder's eyes with something that had moved beyond anger into the more difficult territory of simple, clear-eyed truth. Ava, you placed a crown on my head and sent a blade to remove it. The elder said nothing. Ava, you were afraid. I understand that. A murmur through the hall. Ava, power that comes back from the dead is frightening. Power that has learned from everything that tried to destroy it is more frightening still. I understand why you tried. She leaned forward slightly. Ava, I want every person in this hall to remember this moment. Remember what happens when the throne is tested, and remember that the throne is still here. She sat back. And Ava, proceed. Afterward, Riven found her in the corridor outside, leaning against the stone, eyes closed, the mask temporarily set aside. Riven, you all right? A pause. Ava, no. He stood beside her, their shoulders touching. Ava. But I will be. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That was enough. The dream returns. The dream came back that spring. The silver ground, the coal fire, the moon filling half the sky. But this time the voice was different. It was her mother's voice. She recognized it, even though her mother had been dead for 4 years, and memory softens things over time. It said very simply, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, and I'm so proud of who you became anyway." Ava woke, and her face was wet, and for a long time she lay in the dark and breathed. Then she got up, wrapped herself in something warm. Annie climbed to the highest balcony. Below her, the kingdom slept. The forests and the rivers and the villages, with their small warm lights, all of it breathing together in the dark like one enormous living thing. Behind her, she heard the door. Then 3 separate pairs of footsteps. No urgency. They had felt her waking and had come. Simply, without drama. Kyle stood to her left, Riven to her right, Darius behind her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. The 4 of them looked out at the kingdom together. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. What comes next? 18 months after a girl ran barefoot through the dark with a broken heart, the queen held the court's winter audience. 7 clans represented, a dozen political alliances in various states of negotiation, 3 border disputes, 2 requests for arbitration, and one very confused diplomat from a human government who had spent 40 minutes staring at the stone wolf in the courtyard. Ava handled all of it before lunch. Kyle, standing at her shoulder, permitted himself the smallest of satisfied expressions. Riven, seated at the council table, was drawing something in the margin of his notes that she strongly suspected was not policy-related. Darius was watching the human diplomat with the quiet attention of a man cataloging data. Life, she had found, did not simplify once you had claimed your place in it. It complicated, it deepened, widened, became more layered and more demanding and more extraordinary. More was required of her every month. She gave more every month, and every month she found, to her ongoing astonishment, that she had more to give. The girl who had been told she was nothing. The woman who had chosen to discover what she actually was. They were the same person, which was the most important thing she had learned. You did not become someone new. You became more fully yourself. The storm had always been inside her. She had simply needed the right conditions. After court, she walked alone through the palace garden, a habit she had developed 1 hour per day to simply exist without purpose, to be a person rather than a queen. The snow had melted. The first crocuses were coming up through the dark soil. Stubborn, purple, improbable. She crouched down and looked at them. Something that grows through frozen ground, she thought. Something that has to push against the weight of everything above it just to be seen. She understood that. She stood, straightened, looked out at the kingdom. Somewhere, afar to the east, a crow landed on a fence post and screamed once into the cold air. Ava tilted her head. The crows were messengers in the old tradition. She had learned to listen to them. This one was screaming urgently. She was already turning back toward the palace when Kale appeared in the garden doorway, his expression carrying the particular quality she had come to associate with events that required her full attention. "Kyle, we have a situation." Ava, "East?" Kyle, "Further east than that." He paused. Kyle, "There is a second heir." The word detonated in the silence of the winter garden. A second heir. She thought of her mother, of the choice she had made to run, to hide, of the years before the hiding, of everything she still didn't know about the woman her mother had been before she became a secret. A second heir meant a second hidden child, a sibling she had never known, or something much, much more complicated. Ava looked at Kyle. Her silver eyes were steady, calm, burning with a light that never quite went out anymore, even in sleep. "Ava, tell me everything." They rejected a girl. They created a queen, and the queen was only getting started. End of Book 1. Book 2, The Second Heir, coming soon.